Soyle Podcast. I am not Tom L.C. Ship, but I'm here with...
Jack Gleason.
I'm really SK, though. And today...
In case you didn't know.
In case you didn't know. Today we're operating at 2/3 capacity, but we're going to try and pick up the slack. Don't worry about it. Today we're talking about how to find the better story.
Yeah.
Say you got a really banger idea and you think, this idea is infallible. Otherwise, why would I have thought of it this way? Well... you might find about 10 minutes later that you're not perfect. So let's talk about some good practices, some ideas about how you can make that idea just a little bit better.
Yep. I mean, let's start off by qualifying that not every idea is going to be able to be improved on. Sometimes an idea is just bad.
I would say on the rare occasions, yes.
Yeah.
There are some ideas that are just fucking awful.
I think
please don't have them.
Yeah, please don't have them. I think pretty much anything to do with furries is probably just not.
All right, hold on. Let's not exclude the furry audience.
Oh, okay.
I don't really dig on what you guys are doing, but I'm not here to bash it either. Just don't rub it in my face.
Please don't rub it in my face. Oh God.
No, it's like bad ideas. You can have bad ideas. That's totally fine, as long as I don't have to see them. You know, don't try and publish them. Is what I'm saying. Unless it's a book of really bad ideas, I really want to see that. But that's a whole other thing. That's like a meta level idea.
Yeah.
Hey, let's look at really bad ideas and see why they're bad.
Yeah. Well, hell, that could be its own podcast episode.
All right, let's get through this one.
Yeah. Well, I think kind of the chief example here that we've been talking about for years at this point, American Beauty, right? This movie started off as sort of a comedy, right? And they wrote it, they filmed it, they did all this stuff. The director himself had, the intention of making a comedy, or he thought he was making a comedy. And then during the editing process, they discovered that they could actually make it a much more serious movie, and just by reordering the way that scenes are told and extending some of them or shortening some of them, they modified the way they told the story to make it a very different type of story, and it made it better, right? So that's kind of the idea we're running with here is, when you look at your story from sort of a high level, can you spot the better thing that's waiting to come out? And that's not exactly easy to do, but we do want to go through some of the ways you might spot that.
And to be perfectly clear, American Beauty was an absolute anomaly in terms of becoming a better film. I'd like to see the comedy version, but I don't know.
Yeah.
This is one of those rare instances where in the late game you can make it a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
It's very odd. It's something to think about, though. When you change the music to a scene, or the tempo, or you take the punchline away from a comedy,
mm-hmm.
and you leave just the setup to the joke, it's not a comedy anymore.
Right.
You can entirely change the entire mood of a scene by changing up the music, and through a combination of clever editing, you can turn a comedy into something else, and that's what happened with American Beauty. I just don't think you could do it ever again at the same capacity.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to do that far in. Not so much because it's difficult to see the better thing. I think when you're that far in, you're able to see a lot more things that have been developed, and so it would probably actually be easier to spot the the better story underneath. But it also means that you have a much higher risk of having to redo a lot of what you've already done, right?
Yeah.
So the further along,
a really high budget production like that, discovering that you've made the worst of two movies is very scary, especially to the studio.
Yeah.
There's no way they're going to let you reshoot half the movie because you think there might be a better version,
right?
Because then they're going to say, "Hey, well, what happens when you shoot the rest of this goddamn fucking movie?" And you find out, "Oh wait, there's a third one. There's an even better movie beyond this."
Yeah,
it's the movie that never got made, idiot.
So I think, exactly. So I think the thing to keep in mind is the earlier in the development process that you can spot the better story, the better, because you minimize that risk.
I do want to add one caveat to that, though.
Yeah.
If you're in the very early stages of your idea, and you've just passed that moment where you've had that big brain moment of, holy shit, this is the best idea I've ever had. I have to tell someone about this.
Mm-hmm.
This is such a great idea.
Right.
You know, you're walking around the house really happy. You know, I just came up with the best film anyone will ever see.
Right.
Don't immediately dissect it. Not in that moment.
Right.
Enjoy it for just a minute. Let it simmer.
Yeah.
And then come back about 10 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days or whatever. Yeah, just give it a minute so that you can maintain the heart of the work.
Is this kind of what
don't
you
immediately dissect the idea? Yeah, this is what I was coming.
Yeah. Right before we were kind of looking over notes, and
yeah,
there was. Yeah, I want to
lose the passion behind the idea. You want to maintain the message of it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Like, you should definitely feel free to just keep exploring an idea, right? It's not so much that we want to, immediately start dissecting and questioning yourself. You know, you should follow the inspiration where it takes you, right? But if you are like in a moment of writer's block, or, you know, you've made some progress and, you're just not quite sure of the direction now it needs to go, or you've kind of finished a certain amount and you just want to stop and analyze it now. Those are the moments to kind of start looking at it and asking some of these questions that we're going to be presenting here. Because you don't want to get too bogged down with like questioning yourself in every decision you make. You know, you want to have that free flow of thought without constantly stopping to go, wait, is that the right thing to do? So I think that's a valid point to make. But, you know, that in mind, there are bad things you can do.
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of bad things you can do.
That's not what we're talking
stifling creativity is the worst one.
Sure.
Don't sure me, you fucker. Oh, yeah. That's okay. Baby's first story, right?
Yep.
Fucking dickhead.
Look, man, there is Baby's first story, all right? Watch.
I'm not saying there isn't. But don't treat me like I'm writing my first story.
Am I? Is that something I'm doing?
You listen to this later, and you listen to your sure, and you tell me if it doesn't sound condescending as shit.
Well, I think just the way I talk sounds condescending as shit. So
maybe it is.
It's not intentional. It's just how I am. I apologize.
I don't know which one's worse. That I'm naturally condescending, or that I don't know that I am.
Are we breaking down me, or are we breaking down stories? What are we doing on this podcast? All right. Well, so one of the I think starting points here, you know, the core of really any story is a character, right? Or characters if you're doing an ensemble thing. But generally, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be some central character, right? And say you have this character in mind and you've made some progress in fleshing them out and all this stuff. I think there are a few questions you can start asking yourself about this character to see if, you know, they are in fact the best character for this story, right? One of them is, as the main character, is this character hurting anybody else through their actions, right? It could just be, you know, they're not aware of it, right? But it is, you know, their actions are in fact hurting somebody. If the answer is no, you might want to figure out how to give them that what's called moral weakness. How is it that their actions could be hurting others, and try to make that a part of the story by showing those ramifications. It makes the story more complex. It makes the character change a bit more deeper. And alternatively, you might have a character who is just hurting others, and the question you should ask is, are they hurting others because of a psychological weakness that's like, you know, they're going to overcome? Or are they just an edgelord? And maybe you need to look at that and make them not so edgy for the sake of being edgy.
Edgelords are better as tertiary characters.
Yeah.
In the background. We don't really give a shit about what their story is.
Because they're not, I mean, yeah, they don't have a necessarily... I mean, they might have a reason, right? You, the author, might know why they're that way. But if in the story we're not exploring why, then yeah, they're just kind of villain type characters or whatever. Or just annoying characters, as we touched on last week. or the week before anyway. Now, another thing to keep in mind is, when you're exploring why this character behaves this way, right? Just giving them a backstory isn't really going to make them a better character either.
Looking at you, anime.
Oh, yes. Oh my God. I didn't even think about that, but yes. Backstory isn't character. Telling the audience, like having a massive 10-minute long scene where somebody just tells their backstory so that the audience knows it, that's not character revelation. That's just exposition. It's not really that fun. I mean, I guess some audience members, there's a lot of people who like anime, so I guess, that is something that people enjoy, but it doesn't really do anything for the rest of the plot if that's all that scene is, right? If you took that scene out of the anime, I guess we're just going to roll with the anime example now.
It's the best example of it. I don't know what else.
Yeah. But I mean, if you took that scene out, right, does it affect the rest of the plot? If none of the other characters learned this backstory, does it change anything? And if the answer is no, then that should tell you that the backstory is not relevant. The thing that you want is to figure out what their actions are and how they justify those actions, right? It's the self-justifications that are the character. Those are the weaknesses, and you can use the backstory in those self-justifications, right? But it shouldn't just be, characters, hit somebody or whatever, and they're like, why would you do that? They're like, because my father didn't love me. It's like, no one justifies their actions in that way either, right? Again, their backstory isn't their character. It's if they hit somebody, it's because they have anger issues. Well, and in that moment, they probably have a justification, but we see that their anger is probably, over the top, and their action obviously was morally wrong. And maybe later we can understand that, just over a series of these actions where we get this little bit of revelation about their character and how they justify it to themselves. That's how we then figure out, oh, okay, the root of their anger issues is like, their father didn't love them or whatever. And then, even then, just acknowledging the backstory is not anything that's going to make them suddenly change. Like having their father come back and like talk to them or whatever and like have some reconciliation, it doesn't automatically fix everything that's wrong with the character either, right? There's human beings, and thus characters are very complex creatures. We have habitual behaviors. And so even though this character has this backstory as like the root of their behavior, that's the root, but the plant is still there. You have it takes a lot of work to change behavior. So don't confuse backstory for actual character and character growth, and don't use like the revelation of a backstory as the actual self-revelation and the actual change.
Backstory is only useful in terms of changing other characters' perception of a character,
yeah,
but you should do it subtly.
Yeah.
I don't need a 10-minute block of this is my backstory, you should feel bad for me, now I'm a sympathetic villain.
I mean, obviously that makes a character sympathetic, right? That's
a reason. That's why it happens. That's
right,
why,
exactly.
That's why stories are told that way. But
right.
it's the easiest, lowest hanging fruit version of that.
Right. And the thing is, it makes the character sympathetic to the audience because the audience goes, oh, okay, now I understand. But it shouldn't change necessarily how other characters behave unless they learn the backstory, and then like the character also in revealing their backstory says, and now I want to change, right? Just revealing the backstory without actually changing the character doesn't do anything. Like if somebody in your life hit you in the face repeatedly, and then was like, oh, but also like I get hit a lot at home, you're not going to immediately hug that person and be like, oh, now it's all fine.
I understand.
No.
Now I know why you hit me.
I mean, granted, it's a starting point, right? But it's not the revelation. It's not the character change. It's not the character itself. Just knowing that doesn't solve the problem. It's just looking at the problem in a different way now, but you still have to solve it. So, and now that we're talking about character change, that's another question you should be asking yourself. What is your central character's character change? Do they change? So we talked about this in the virtuous characters episode. It's talking about how sometimes a virtuous character can be somebody who just doesn't change throughout the story, right? They instead operate as somebody who's trying to change the world around them to be more like them. And part of why we don't think virtuous characters are very interesting is because they don't change, right? They don't struggle. So the question you should be asking is, what is your character's central character change? Do they go from, believing one thing to another? Do they, gain a deeper understanding of the world? What is their starting weakness, right? And do they overcome it by the end, or are they unable to overcome it? Is the world just too oppressive and they just aren't able to escape the, figurative enslavement? And along that line, are the other characters that they interact with pushing them along towards that change, right? Is another character, are all the other characters, challenging the decisions they're making and saying, you are not acting in a way that is morally correct? Or are other characters saying, hey, this thing you just did, that's a good thing you should keep doing, right? Are other characters encouraging the change, and are certain other characters pushing back against their current behavior? If the answer is no, then you need to be analyzing what the point of those characters or your main character is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, every character should challenge the main character in some way. And not facetious challenges. They should challenge the core of their character. Yeah. The decisions they make. Everything, even if it's not, a fight.
Right.
It needs to be conflict.
Yeah.
And I think some people lose sight of this when they watch, films that are like holiday movies or family movies.
Yeah.
There's a lot of arguing in families. Watch a holiday movie that you saw as a kid and watch it now, and you'll realize that it's riddled with it is horrifying to watch almost. You're like, wow, that's my family.
Yeah.
The conflict is beyond tense. You'll watch an action movie just to relax.
Well, so in certain holiday movies, right? The good Hollywood, the good holiday movies. The Hallmark Channel movies, probably not.
Oh yeah, no. That's the same 10 movies, just painted differently every year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there should always be conflict, and a character should exist to push another character around, right? In terms of whatever their change is, right? The main character isn't the only one who should be changing. Other characters can change too. And so any character that interacts with another should be, pushing the other character in some direction along this character change. So that's something you should be asking yourself about your main character and all your other characters and how they interrelate to each other. Another really big one is your world, right? This, I feel like not very many people think about the world and how it relates to their story, right? A lot of people will want to tell some like epic story in some fantasy world, and they'll, do a lot of world building, but then their story just doesn't fit for that world. And just because it's a good versus evil story or whatever doesn't necessarily mean it fits for a fantasy world. If the world isn't serving a purpose in the story and it's just a backdrop, then you probably need to do something to change up either your story world or the character to make it fit better with the world that you're exploring. And this is a really difficult thing to do. It could almost be a podcast episode on its own, but go ahead. You had something to say?
Yeah, it's another argument of intention.
Yeah.
If you're constructing a story and you have this intention of, I want this to be the story that I'm telling, and you've already figured out, you've done the legwork to find out that that's really at least one of the better versions of the idea, you have to make sure that your characters and the world are in sync. The world needs to be representative of at least some of the themes.
Yeah.
And once you have those things working in tandem, they'll start changing each other.
Yeah.
You won't be able to avoid it. That's just the cascade of the natural storytelling order.
Exactly.
But, I mean, look at any really, really great story. The world is representative of the struggle that the characters are going through.
Exactly.
And it doesn't have to be super nuanced. I mean, hopefully it is, but it doesn't actually have to be that clever.
Mm-hmm.
It can really be on the nose, and it's kind of interesting when you take away the blinders of that interpretation and just look at it and say, well, this story is all about greed and takes place in corporate America, and you're like, oh wow,
It's like,
that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Why wouldn't it take place in corporate America?
Right. Exactly. And so I think that's the question right there is why wouldn't it take place here, right? When we see a story that takes place in a setting that makes sense, we don't even question it. It's when it takes place
that's the level of subtlety you're going for. Is
right.
That when people don't even notice that it's perfect.
Right. And I think an example that I thought of a little bit ago was just like, if you're telling a story about like somebody being kidnapped, but it's taking place in a medieval fantasy setting, like why? Why are you doing that?
You better have a good reason to be using the medieval
exactly.
fantasy setting. It better be a world where it better be in a world where only that kind of thing could take place.
Right. Right. Exactly. We the audience are immediately going to go, wait, this doesn't make sense to me as to why we're in this sort of setting when this is the type of story we're telling. And so you as the author better understand why you're choosing to do that and how it's going to ultimately serve the type of story that you're telling or the message or whatever. Because when you pick, and we've covered this a few different times now, but when you pick a world that's not ours or is in some way different, you are implicitly making a statement about the world. And whatever changes you've made, you are implicitly saying that, like, this change can't exist in the real world because of X, Y, or Z. So you're automatically making a commentary about the real world. And so if you are going to write a story that is taking place in this, fantasy world, hopefully by the end, your story is going to have something to say about like society or the world at large. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense, right? The world, it doesn't make any sense. The other point I wanted to say about story world, beyond just the thematic concept of it, but is just that your story world is an active participant in the story. It's not a backdrop, right? It's not enough to necessarily say or make it thematically make sense, because people interact with their world every day. You are currently interacting with your world right now. We're not even aware of it, but it's a constant presence, right? And so the world you choose to tell your story in has to be in some way integrated with the story in an active way, not just a backdrop type way or a thematic way, but also, the way that the world works in your story has to help to either, push the character along their journey or hinder them in some way or, whatever. It needs to be involved because that's the way reality works, right? We are constantly interacting with the world. And so your characters are constantly interacting with the world. You should be picking a world that is going to be actively involved.
Yeah, you've surrendered the simplicity of the common world and common knowledge when you choose a fantasy setting. So you cannot rely on common experience.
Mm-hmm.
By choosing the fantasy setting, you're choosing one of the hardest settings. Same thing with sci-fi. It's
right.
You're saying something by choosing that setting, and if the people interact with that setting in a way that is not in line with our common experiences, you're making a point.
Right.
And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing anything at all, and no one understands why you chose the setting to begin with. And the bigger problem with that is that I lost my train of thought.
I was just picturing like another example of like a bad fit. It's like, and like the characters not interacting with the world. It's like, imagine, I don't know if anybody's seen 12 Angry Men. It's a very good movie. I highly recommend it. It's one of those, like, the whole story takes place in one room and it's just people talking, and it's wonderful. It's very explicit about like the morality of, well, the justice system. It's really great. Black and white. So, if somebody's leery of watching a black and white movie.
Do you see the setting? Do you see the jury
right.
in a courtroom,
right,
chosen to discuss law and morality?
Right.
Why wouldn't they be?
Now imagine that entire movie just randomly taking place in a medieval setting or in space, and nothing about the story changes.
Oh, I remembered my bigger problem. One of the bigger issues of choosing a sci-fi or fantasy setting without a real purpose for it is that a lot of people try to lean on the idea that fantasy and sci-fi have all these established elements, and they say, well, it's not the common world, but it is a world that we're familiar with. The thing is that every time that someone tries to do a fantasy or sci-fi setting, they try and change it somehow. They try and do something new or nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
Harry Potter is not the same thing as Lord of the Rings.
Right.
And Alien is not the same thing as, the Terminator or something. They're
Right.
different variations on the idea of this is the future, or this is the past, or this is an alternate world.
Mhm.
But there's one really fundamental distinction between them.
Yeah.
And if you're just going to pick a general fantasy setting and say, okay, this is the world that the story takes place in, don't worry about it, I'm immediately going to worry about it.
Yeah.
I have nothing else but to wonder, why the fuck is this story happening? Why are there wizards?
Right.
The wizards aren't doing anything. I don't understand.
Yeah.
I spend the whole story just wondering why.
Yeah.
Why are we here? When do we get to the point where the world matters?
Yeah.
And if I'm
Exactly.
worried about that the whole time, I'm not gonna be able to pay attention to the story.
Yeah, imagine the world of Harry Potter, but we're following a character who's not a wizard, and he just goes to regular school. And all he does is like occasionally hear about like the attacks that happen towards the end by the Death Eaters and shit. He just sees that in the newspaper or whatever, and he doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't engage with it in any way. Why is he in that world then? Why are we telling the story in that world? Why does it matter?
Harry Potter from fucking the Dursleys' perspective after Harry leaves, while Harry's in school.
Yeah,
it's just like, I don't fucking care.
Exactly. I mean, there is a story. Like, the thing is, like, there is a story to be told. Those characters probably could have interesting lives if we follow them. But
you can't get hung up on the magic part when you're trying to tell the story of a normal person.
Exactly. Unless, of course, the actual like point of your story. This is kind of going back to the why of it, right? The only reason I can see justifying putting a normal person and following the normal person's story in like a wizard world is to highlight the idea of what it's like to be a character in that type of a world, what it's like to feel like you don't belong, right? It's about, and so the character themselves would need to have like that kind of a weakness of, I don't feel like I belong or whatever, right? So then it makes sense again, right? It might not be quite as interesting, but it does at least make sense now,
at least it's
because
functional.
Right, exactly.
At least I'm not questioning the actual integrity of the story, and now I can just look at the story and say, oh, okay.
Right. And that actually perfectly transitions us into kind of the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is if there's another character that seems to keep hogging the limelight or seems to keep propping up and you're not sure why, it's possible they are the ones who need to be the central character. So even if you do pick this perfect character who exists in this magical setting, and it's about them not feeling like they fit in this world, if there's some like grand battle that's happening in the background, and some hero of that story keeps propping up in the news, and all your main character is doing is like being aware of them while they're going about their own lives, maybe your story really should be about the person who's fighting that epic battle in the background. Right? I mean, that's why Harry Potter doesn't follow the fucking Dursleys and instead follows Harry Potter.
Yeah, you might find that's the situation.
Yeah.
If you just can't wait for the secondary character to come in and like make the scene interesting, then I think they might be the main character, dog. You might want to pivot.
Yeah.
Don't stick to an idea just because it was the first idea. Ultimately, that's what everything's about. Don't get stuck with the same idea just because it was the first idea and it's your baby. Be willing to kill that baby. You gotta switch to the good one.
And one of the things that makes a character, more interesting than another, well, one of the many things, but is if they actually have drive. Right? Does this character actually have a desire? What is it? Right? Why do they want that thing? What about this character is hindering them from getting that thing? The actions that they're taking should be, in direct contrast to the weakness, in order to force them into confronting that weakness. And a character that doesn't have any drive, who's just kind of like, lets things happen to them. There's a place for that, but you can't have another character who is way more driven than your main character and think that the la-da-da character is the main character, because they just aren't going to be. They're not going to be as interesting because the driven character is the one that actually drives the plot. They're the ones who are actively pursuing a goal. So if your character isn't actively pursuing a goal, you should probably be questioning why that is, and if there's another character that is better suited, or if you need to give this character a better desire, a deeper desire that is going to force them into action.
Yeah. All I can think of right now is that there's a caveat to everything, and that there are very, very specific parody-like examples where you can throw all these rules out the window and make a story that's about a character who's just boring as shit, and they keep running into really great and crazy things, and just end up being a side character, but they're the main character that we follow the entire time. It's not impossible to tell a story like that. But it is about intention. You have to know that you're doing that. You have to be very aware that you're doing that on purpose. And
then the audience is basically going to expect that you are going to have a lot of meta jokes about it, for that very reason, right? So yeah, be aware of it and craft your story along that line. A character who is kind of la-di-da, like, you can have a story about that, because there's tons of people who, don't have a lot of direction in their lives. And it's like, that totally makes sense for a character to be that way too. But maybe the story would be better served to have that type of character be, have a desire that is so great that now they're forced to take action, even though it goes against their, internal character. And thus, throughout the story, they are constantly forced to make decisions, even though it's against what they actually naturally want to do. And so over the course of the story, they overcome that, and they become a more driven character by being forced to be a driven character throughout the story. So yeah, it's there's caveats and there's exceptions, but there's arguments in favor, but also you can turn those arguments in favor into still doing the thing that's the more interesting thing. So yeah,
reject modernity, embrace tradition. Okay, I've got two more points I'd like to cover before we wrap up here. The first one is, take it from SK. Here's a little test you can use on your own story when you're in the early writing stages, and I call it the classic story elements check. And that's the very optimistic point of view. If you want to call it something else from the pessimistic point of view, you can call it the cliche check. So what I like to do is, at the beginning of the writing process, when I've got a couple of characters and I kind of know the overarching themes and I know where I'm going, what I like to do is I like to look at the story and say, okay, where have I seen these characters before?
Ah, yeah.
Where are these? What inspiration am I pulling from? Is this a Hamlet? Is this a Frodo? Is this who is this? What character is this? Right. Because there's a distinction between what I'm talking about. There's a classic story elements and there's cliches, and the only difference between them is execution. There's a reason that there's 1,000 Frodo knockoffs and they're cliches, and there's a reason that Frodo continues to be the prime example. Well, what is it? It's the execution. A cliche is only a cliche if it's done poorly. I've said it before and I'll say it 1,000 times. Why is it that even if Lord of the Rings isn't your first experience with a high fantasy film or high fantasy story in general, why is it that you can see the 1,000 Frodo knockoffs and then see Lord of the Rings and realize that Frodo is the best version of that? Even if he encompasses all the different features that the other 1,000 knockoffs have, why is it that Frodo continues to be the most interesting version? It's because he's the most perfectly executed. The classics are the classics for a fucking reason. So what I like to do is I like to check my story and see if I have any of those. If I have
classic
any knockoffs.
Characters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. You don't have to get rid of them because they are classical. Because they represent
absolutely not
a trope. If you have those characters, the only thing you need to worry about is executing them correctly. Using them in the best way possible. Because there's plenty of fantasy stories that are very successful. And they all share, a lot of fantasy stories anyway, they share a lot of commonalities. And the only reason that Lord of the Rings continues to be the masterpiece of fantasy storytelling is because it's the most perfectly executed.
Right.
But that doesn't take anything away from, Game of Thrones in the earlier parts. And
yeah, good clarifier there.
And other I sometimes lump sci-fi with fantasy because it's
essentially the same thing.
It pretty much is. It's just science over magic.
Yeah, you're replacing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to say something about the classic characters, because I think, to your point, classic characters are strengths in your story. We look for these types of characters in all stories. It gives us a little bit of a safety in that, we go, oh, okay, this is the guy that, I can, root for and stuff like that. Right. It gives us something that we can be familiar with immediately, to understand what's going on. So we can now, follow along with the story. And you want to embrace that. If you can identify which characters are the classic characters in your story, or the classic character archetypes in your story, you want to embrace that. You don't want to change it so that they aren't fitting those molds. You want to make the character fit into that mold, probably even more so, and then identify how they fit within your story. How does your story, utilize these types of archetypes to tell a new form of story, right? So the knockoffs, the reason like the Frodo knockoffs aren't very successful is because they don't recognize the archetype that Frodo is, and they don't do something different with it. What they do is just try to tell the same Lord of the Rings style story with the Frodo type character and say, but I changed it to, be called something else. And, instead it's a, golden dildo he's carrying. It's, there's no actual difference. It's all just surface level. What you want to do is recognize what the archetype is, and then recognize their position within your story and what you're doing differently, while still being the same archetype. It's kind of difficult to explain, but that's essentially what you want to do.
It's an important distinction. If you can recognize that there's an archetypal base to your character, every other nuance to them is you.
Yeah.
And that's where you really get to distinguish them from other characters.
Right.
Because there are a lot of knight type characters in virtually any story, even in stories that aren't fantasy. But we can pick out different knight characters and say that they're very different from each other, even if their function and the thing that they do in the story is the same. The way that they behave, the way that they interact with other characters is very different.
Right.
And that's where a lot of these knockoff characters don't thrive, is because they're trying so hard to be the version that worked that they're not trying to make it the version that works right now.
Yeah.
So, sort of a loose segue from that is my other point. It's an animation adage, it's a film adage, it's important, and if you can think of it in terms of writing, it's also a really great point.
Mm-hmm.
Showing and not telling.
Yes.
If you can show us something instead of telling us, it is going to be infinitely better.
I think a fantastic example of that would be that opening sequence in Up.
Right.
There's no dialogue. I mean, obviously there's some dialogue when they meet or whatever, but then that 10-minute just montage, you understand everything that's happening there because they explore all of it visually.
Yeah. If you look at it from an animation perspective, it's very literal, because in the beginnings of animation, we generally stray away from dialogue and narration, because it takes away from the actual animating aspect. It should be gesture and character driven, and it should be, we should see it. The character should show us and not have to tell us everything. Otherwise, I'm not really getting anything out of it. I could read the lines from the script and get the same thing I'm getting out of it.
Right.
So in animation, it's very literal. We want to see it. We want to see the gesture. We want to see the actions. Right. But in film, people can give someone a line, and the line can tell us everything we need to know for the scene. But I mean, look at Vince Gilligan with Breaking Bad. We get a lot of aspect-to-aspect shots where we see details, and over those details and throughout the episode, we get an idea of what's coming. Right. We get all these little snippets of the information we need to know, and then by the end of the story, by the end of the episode anyway, we find out that either we're correct and we're been properly set up for the scene, or our expectations are reversed. And the thing is that when you tell us something straight away, we don't get the benefit of an interpretation, and we don't get the benefit of having it reversed on us. So you lose all the subtlety, and you lose the chance to really surprise us. So telling is the worst version of storytelling, interestingly enough. Yeah. Showing us is far better. The only time that telling us is important is if the narrator or the person that's telling us is not trustworthy. That's a really interesting device that you can use. And I shudder to say that because I don't want people to start saying, okay, narration is good to use as long as the character isn't trustworthy, because that's facetious. That's a little bit of that's a loophole. Just because your character's a dickhead and sometimes they lie doesn't mean that you should use them to narrate everything so that I'm constantly wondering what the fucking story's about. If it's a character study about a guy who's unstable, then it's interesting.
Yeah.
But
and then what you want to do is still, even in that, you want to be able to show how they're untrustworthy, because if they say something
we
that's
need to
untrue,
see that they're wrong.
Right. How are we supposed to know that they're not telling us the truth unless we see that the thing they tell us is wrong? And that's the thing. And I think this really goes back also to the whole backstory thing that we were talking about, of like, just telling us a character's backstory doesn't actually tell us anything. It doesn't do anything for the story. We aren't being shown what this character is about. We're being told. And yeah, it's not an enjoyable experience to be told something instead of being shown something. The point of a story is to experience the change and not just be told it.
I've been known to enjoy anime from time to time, but if I'm watching a show where I know they're going to go into backstory bits for a while, like Naruto does it all the time. Yeah. Every time that happens, I zone out. I literally cannot pay attention. Sometimes I'll miss an entire character's backstory, and you know what? I don't fucking miss out on anything.
Yep.
I don't miss anything when it comes to the story.
Yep.
I just wonder why everyone's kind of sad when they kill him. They're like, exactly. He told us all this stuff about his horrible life, and it's like, yeah, but that doesn't undo the 300 people he just murdered, did it? And
so that's the thing, is that like we see that they're all sad at the end, and that's really the only thing we care about. We we didn't lose anything by not hearing their backstory. The only thing that we gained from being told their backstory is that other characters now are slightly more sympathetic. But guess what? That whole 10-minute block of explaining the backstory to get to the characters being more sympathetic, we see it when the character dies and the other characters are a little bit sad now.
I'd much prefer a much more condensed version of backstory to happen right after their death, so that it's tragic. So I could be like, oh shit, maybe he didn't have to die. Because then I might be a little more sympathetic. Maybe then it's like, oh, now that it's too late, I can say, oh man, if only if. But you show me before he dies, and it's like, nah, kill this guy, get him out of here. This guy's an idiot. Look at him. He just killed 300 people. Fuck this guy. So
I do hope that some of these things have been helpful. I hope it wasn't too judgmental. I know or at least I can be known for being a little bit judgmental of people who are just exploring, or at least I come across that way apparently. That's not our intention.
These notes are vicious.
I don't intend to
criticize yourself.
Yeah, that's really what we're getting at. Criticize yourself and be intentional about the decisions you're making in your story.
Think of it this way: if you're worried about people just absolutely hammering your story because it sucks, or you think that it sucks, if you criticize yourself, I mean, eventually you get to the point where you don't even care, and that's where you want to be. Easy. Honestly,
easy.
Well, you want to be able to hear criticism and not get your feelings hurt.
Learning to criticize yourself to find the better story underneath is a really important skill. So hopefully we've given you guys some questions. Yeah, exactly. Some things you can do to maybe help better discover that. So,
all right, pals.
Now, thank you for joining us.
If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you subscribe, it really helps us. I don't know how to explain it, but it makes us feel better. First of all, and it makes it feel like we're actually doing something instead of talking in my closet like I am right now. But
come out of the closet, SK.
I'm halfway in the closet.
Oh, okay.
But not in a gay way.
See,
yeah. If you like this content, I mean, absolutely obliterate that like button.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah, do the thing, right? Leave a comment. I don't even care if it's a good comment. I'd like it to be constructive, but if it's not, I'll fight you.
Help us discover the better podcast underneath.
Yeah, I want to fucking fight in the comments. It's okay. Believe me, I will go to blows. It's okay. There's not that many. There's like two. There's been like 2 comments so far out of all of them.
Yeah.
So if you leave a couple comments, I will fight you. It's a challenge. And again, subscribe. I mean, come on. You don't want to follow someone you hate? You don't want to fight with me all the time? Subscribe.
Yeah.
You're already to this point. You're already listening to this fucking blurb. What are you doing?
Do it.
Why aren't you subscribed already? I wish that they still had private messaging on YouTube so I could actually go to blows with somebody so I could meet you somewhere and actually fight you.
Wow.
But don't bring that COVID around me, dog. Anyway. Bye.
Bye.